Have you ever noticed that some people, they kind of equate cynicism with insight, or even enlightenment or wisdom? Those who not only see the glass, half empty, but believe that some idiot will spill the glass all over the floor, so why even bother with the glass in the first place? And I often hear a tinge or even a dollop of arrogance from these people, as if they have clearer insight to life than the rest of us. Like when the Vegas Golden Knights made the NHL Finals last spring, I wrote something on social media like, who would have predicted this back in October? And of course, some enlightened person spoke up and said, yep, it's amazing what money can buy, isn't it, eh? The Vegas Golden Knights, they picked up the scraps from other teams. Does that make them like finalists? Because the New York Rangers tried to buy a Stanley Cup, and the New York Yankees tried to buy a World Series by jacking up their payroll, but both failed miserably. And that's the main reason I don't bet on sports, because money cannot buy wins. We know this because the Detroit Lions beat the New England Patriots last week, and that's a case in point. But then again, the Patriots are playing really badly this season. That really warms my heart. Or I think of when I expressed my profound disappointment with Bill Hybels, who's the pastor at Willow Creek Community Church just outside of Chicago. At least he used to be until recently. And he's a pastor whose books on leadership were formative for me when I was a young pastor just starting out, and whose vision and leadership I admired, but who allegedly had been victimizing female members of his staff for decades, and he had an affair with a parishioner, all the while writing books about character and ethics. And when I shared this with folks, I received an insightful response to my disappointment. Someone said, hey, stop the presses, he turns out to be human. Really? That's what we're expecting? Does that explain or excuse his behavior? Behavior which detonated his legacy? Yes, people are hypocrites, but Hybels' behavior was egregious enough to lose everything he built. Because cynicism is not insight. Pessimism is not being realistic. Sarcasm is not wit. Well, not always. But I have to admit, I often fall into this trap. There are moments when I see the world through a cynical lens, and there are times when I preach through that lens. And some of your comments on the way out the door have suggested that my sermons recently have been a little gloomy. That's fair. I appreciate the feedback. After all, I'm the guy who turned the song All You Need Is Love into a protest against racism, sexism, and homophobia. Because it's easy to get pessimistic about the future and even the present. And it's easy to be cynical about the world. If all you hear is bad news, you might wonder why everyone doesn't give up. Open up a bottle of wine or two and sink into a Netflix binge every night. So it might be the work of the Holy Spirit that last summer, when putting together this series, I chose the song Here Comes the Sun as today's selection as part of our Jesus Radio Superstar Beatles edition, and this week as a remedy against the gloominess of the past few weeks. This song was meant to lighten a gloomy season, literally. George Harrison wrote this song after a long, cold, lonely London winter, and he was glad that spring had finally arrived. And he blew off a business meeting to go to Eric Clapton's house to enjoy Clapton's garden that was coming into bloom in springtime, where he wrote this song. Harrison says, Here Comes the Sun was written at the time when Apple Records was getting like school, where we had to go and be businessmen, sign this and sign that. Anyway, it seems as if winter in England goes on forever. Tell me about it. By the time spring comes, you really deserve it. So one day I decided I was going to sag off Apple and went over to Eric Clapton's house. The relief of not having to go see all those dopey accountants was wonderful. And I walked around the garden with one of Eric's acoustic guitars and wrote, Here Comes the Sun. Written in April 1969, a year that had the most sunlight hours recorded in London in the 1960s, which was preceded by the colder and snowier February and March than was the norm in London. So when Harrison wrote Here Comes the Sun, he was being literal. No imagination needed to understand what he was saying. The song was recorded in July 1969 at Abbey Road Studios and released in September of that year on the album of the same name. This recording doesn't include John Lennon on it because he was recovering from a car accident. As I said, there's no hidden meaning in this song. You don't have to go digging around looking for special insight. It's a happy, clappy song, and it's meant to be. George Harrison was just glad that spring had finally come after a particularly hard winter. And given last year's endless winter, this is a message we can all relate to. But because this song is so easy to understand, I, of course, had to make things difficult. So I chose a passage from the most complex books in the Bible to pair it with, where imagination is needed to understand it. A passage that's dripping with symbolism and is not meant to be literal. Well, I chose this section from Revelation mainly because it has the word son in it. I didn't really flex my muscles there. But also because of what this woman of the apocalypse represents. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth. There's much speculation as to who this woman is or who or what she represents. Some say she's the Virgin Mary, and the child is Jesus, since the child is to rule over the nations with an iron rod, and Jesus rules over heaven and earth. Others say she represents the church, and the child represents faithful Christians throughout history. Since the church was being persecuted at the time of its writing, many commentators think that this image was meant to serve as comfort and encouragement to persecuted Christians. Others believe that she represents the nation of Israel, since the images of the sun, moon, and stars were borrowed from Genesis 37, where Joseph dreams of the sun and the moon as his father and mother, and the 11 stars as his brothers who bow down to him. And since this child will rule over all the nations, those who believe that Israel will play that role in history see this woman as the nation of Israel. But Lutheran scholar Craig Kessler, he says this: the woman encompasses the story of Israel, from whom the Messiah was born, as well as the story of the church, which was persecuted after Jesus' death and resurrection. John's visionary account of the threat against the woman and the woman's preservation uses imagery that encompasses many moments in the story of God's people. This allows the story to apply to people in many times and places. In other words, it's kind of open-ended. But I think she represents God's promise of newness. She is pregnant. She's clothed by the sun. She gives birth. She's a symbol of God's promise that the persecuted church will not only survive, but will prevail. And not just the persecuted church, the whole world, since the child will rule over everything. But even this image doesn't really tell the whole story. In this passage, the woman is attacked while she is in the agony of giving birth. And the child is stolen from her right after he is born. And fearing for her life, she flees into the wilderness. This week, when violence against women is in the news, this image speaks to me in an immediate way. With the sentencing of Bill Cosby and the controversy surrounding Judge Brett Kavanaugh, many women have come out to share their own stories of being victimized, stories that they have buried for years or even decades. And many women have shared that watching Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony on Thursday have caused them to relive their own trauma. I like to believe that things are getting better in this area, getting better for women, that the younger generation would be more sensitive to how men have treated women over the years. But I was horrified to see that this past week, across the street from my beloved Wilfrid Laurier University, where I did my first 2 degrees, some young guys had the gall to hang a banner outside their frat house that said, "She got to call you daddy for her first 18 years, now it's our turn." And I'm guessing they're testing their boundaries as kids do, but I'm guessing their boundaries got pretty well tested when the police showed up at their house, and rightly so. But they're not the first to do this. When I was doing my undergrad, I remember guys hanging decorations in the dining hall with signs that said, "No means giving her another beer." And they even signed their name by putting their residence floor number at the bottom of each banner. And I find it stunning that these young men back then and even today would display their misogyny so openly and brazenly. Because victimizing women does not make you a man. It makes you an entitled little child who takes what isn't yours. And I'm horrified to see that there's still so much work to do. This past week, I had the opportunity to be on a podcast with other clergy, talking about Me Too and Church Too, when we discussed the church's role in both historic behavior toward women and with present realities. With the Roman Catholic Church on the news every day, purging their own demons, and those lesser-known church leaders, such as Bill Hybels, and even the ones who are local, abusing people. The Church Too movement has brought to light that which has been hidden for far too long. So with victimizers being made public, here comes the sun, shining light on abuse and demanding that something be done about it. Sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant. Here comes the sun, exposing past abuses and present wrongs, and allowing us now to talk openly about what had been experienced for far too long, so the future can be very different. Here comes the sun, the brightness, warmth, and healing of the morning after a long, cold, dark, lonely, and terrifying night. Here comes the sun, bringing a new day where new possibilities for human relationships can grow, where victims are empowered, and victimizers and their enablers are held to account. Here comes the sun with smiles returned to their faces. It seems like years since we've been here, the song says. That's because it has. People tend to think of the book of Revelation as a doomsday prediction, but it's not. It's the opposite of doomsday. The book of Revelation is about the birth of something new. John calls that newness the New Jerusalem, and that was his way of saying that God is creating a whole new world out of a world that was bent on destroying itself. Revelation is not a warning against the trials that are to come. Revelation is a celebration that God is building something new out of the ashes of human destruction. Revelation is a song of praise for what God is doing with the world, beginning with God's people, the church, you folks. Revelation is a message of hope that something good will rise when the world's death-dealing powers appear to have won. Revelation is about resurrection. When death covers you, God lifts you up into something new and something beautiful. Revelation is a promise that when your life looks like it's over and everything you've built and fought for seems to crumble, a new day will arrive when you can see the newness in your life and you move forward along your life's path with hope as your guide. Revelation is an affirmation of your trust and your faith. Those of you who look to the future, knowing that whatever life throws at you, you know in your bones and you know in your spirit that God has not given up on you and has not given up on the world. You know with everything you have that God will have the final victory in your life and in this world. Revelation is about the sun coming out after a long, cold, lonely winter. A season in life when the sky is dark, the cold endures from month to month, and you wonder if the winter will never end. And then, here comes the sun. And sometimes the best and only response is to sing the simplest of songs, expressing the gratitude that has risen in our hearts. No expansive poetry needed. No words to echo through the ages, just a simple expression of thanks. Here comes the sun. Do, 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 do. Here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun, I say. It's all right. Instead of cynicism, God gives us hope. Instead of pessimism, God gives us faith. Instead of endless winter, God will bring endless spring. Because as Psalm 30 says, weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. In other words, here comes the sun. And may this be so among us. Amen.